The winter of 1944 in Europe was cold beyond measure. Snow covered the ruins of small villages, and the air carried the echo of artillery that had not stopped for months. The people who still lived among the rubble moved quietly, wrapped in worn coats and hunger. Into this landscape came young American soldiers, men who had crossed oceans to fight in places they had never heard of before. They were tired, their faces rough from frost and fear, but their eyes still held something that the war had not yet taken away. For the civilians who watched them arrive, there was confusion and dread. Would these new soldiers bring more suffering, or could they bring hope? Imagine the sound of boots crunching over frozen streets, the low hum of military trucks idling near the town square. In the doorways, children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide and silent. The soldiers, carrying rifles and heavy packs, could feel the stares that followed them. They had been told to secure the area, to move carefully, to expect hostility. Yet what they found were people too weary to resist. The smell of smoke from burned houses lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of diesel and damp uniforms. It was not victory they found in these places, but the raw consequence of war. Many of the GIs had seen battle already. They had walked through the shattered fields of France and across bombed-out cities where the walls still bore bullet holes. Yet every new town brought a reminder of what the war had done to the innocent. When they entered a village and saw an old woman trying to light a small fire in a broken stove, or a young boy clutching a loaf of bread as if it were gold, the harshness of their mission momentarily faded. The soldiers knew that the enemy had left destruction behind, but seeing it through the faces of civilians made it painfully real. The line between soldier and savior began to blur. In the evenings, when the gunfire quieted, the men gathered around makeshift fires. The snow hissed as it melted beside them. Some spoke about home, about families waiting far away. Others simply sat in silence, listening to the wind move through the empty streets. A few of them reached into their rations and pulled out pieces of chocolate or canned meat, gifts they would later offer to the children who lingered nearby. It was not planned or commanded. It came naturally, as if humanity was fighting to stay alive inside them. For every moment of fear, there was an equal moment of compassion trying to rise. For the civilians, these gestures were confusing at first. They had seen soldiers before, men in uniforms who shouted orders and took what they wanted. But the Americans were different. They smiled when they could, shared their cigarettes, and sometimes even helped carry water from wells that had frozen over. One soldier might patch a roof with scraps of canvas from his tent, while another fixed a door with pieces of a broken crate. Slowly, the villagers began to see something they had not seen in years: kindness without demand. It felt fragile, like something that could disappear at any moment. Yet it gave them reason to believe that not all soldiers were the same. The war itself did not pause for these moments. Bombers still roared overhead, tanks still rolled across the fields, and death remained close. But within that chaos, there were quiet scenes that history almost forgot. A GI kneeling to hand a crying child his own gloves, a medic wrapping the wound of a civilian before tending to himself, a group of soldiers clearing debris from a church so the villagers could gather again. These were not acts of strategy but of conscience. They happened in the shadows of destruction, yet they burned brighter than any flare on the battlefield. As the armies moved forward, each encounter left a mark. The soldiers carried those memories with them, even as they fought through the next town or across the next river. They had come to fight an enemy, but what they found were people, fragile, frightened, and still capable of gratitude. The line between liberation and occupation was thin, yet within it grew a space where decency could still exist. The soldiers may not have known it then, but their small acts of mercy would ripple far beyond the war's end. In every conflict, there are stories that do not make it into the official reports. The victories and losses are counted, but not the moments when a soldier gave his last biscuit to a starving family, or when laughter briefly replaced the sound of gunfire. These are the moments that tell us who we are beneath the uniform, beneath the flags and orders. As the Americans continued their march through Europe and the Pacific, their kindness became its own quiet rebellion. It reminded both sides that even in war, compassion could survive. And for the civilians who witnessed it, those brief sparks of humanity became the first signs that the world might someday heal. War is a strange teacher. It strips away layers of civility, leaving behind instinct and survival. By 1944, both soldiers and civilians had learned to expect the worst from one another. Villages that once thrived with the sound of church bells and market chatter were now hushed, wary places where every knock on the door might mean danger. When American GIs entered these scarred landscapes, they were met not with cheers, but with silence. The villagers had seen too much to trust uniforms, no matter what flag they carried. Fear lingered like smoke, thick and inescapable. To the civilians, soldiers were symbols of power, not mercy. German troops, retreating only days before, had taken what little food was left, burned homes, and left bodies in the streets. So when new soldiers came, foreigners with different accents and strange equipment, people braced themselves for more of the same. Mothers hid their children, farmers buried their remaining grain, and elders watched from windows as convoys passed. The memories of occupation had taught them to expect cruelty, and hope had long since become a luxury they could not afford. Yet, slowly, something began to shift. The first time an American soldier shared his rations, it seemed almost unbelievable. A young boy, gaunt and barefoot, stood near a jeep, staring at the chocolate bar in the soldier's hand. There was a pause, a hesitation that spoke of years of hunger and distrust. When the boy finally reached out and took it, his eyes widened, not just at the sweetness on his tongue, but at the kindness it represented. Word spread quickly among the villagers. The Americans were different. They gave instead of took. It was a small moment, but it rippled through hearts that had forgotten how to feel safe. For the soldiers, the contrast was just as jarring. They had been trained to see the world in black and white, allies and enemies, victory and defeat. But standing face to face with civilians, mothers holding babies, men too old to fight, they began to see shades of grey. These people were not enemies. They were victims of the same war that had torn them from their own homes. The soldiers had come to destroy enemy forces, yet here they were, rebuilding trust brick by brick, one gesture at a time. It was a realization that changed the way many of them saw their mission. There were moments of tension, of course. Not every meeting was peaceful. In some villages, suspicion ran deep, and civilians would not come near the troops. A single shot fired in the distance could undo hours of fragile goodwill. Some soldiers, hardened by battle, refused to lower their guard. They had lost friends and could not easily separate the innocent from the guilty. Yet even then, the acts of compassion from others stood out more strongly. Each time a GI chose kindness instead of suspicion, he challenged the logic of war itself. This contrast between violence and humanity became the emotional core of their experience. Imagine standing in a war-torn square where burned-out tanks rust in silence, and suddenly hearing the sound of laughter as a group of soldiers plays with local children. That sound, fragile yet pure, was proof that the human heart could still resist the darkness. The soldiers were not saints. They were tired, afraid, and often broken, but in choosing compassion, they showed courage of a different kind. The courage to remain human in a place designed to erase humanity. For civilians, those moments changed everything. The same people who once hid behind locked doors began to step outside, carrying buckets of water or loaves of bread to share. The soldiers, in turn, accepted their gratitude with humility. They were not seeking glory. They were seeking connection. It was a strange sight for both sides. A meeting of the wounded and the weary, trying to heal one another without words. The contrast between what the war demanded and what their hearts chose became one of the quietest revolutions of all. As the weeks passed, that fragile trust grew stronger. The soldiers continued their advance, yet everywhere they went, traces of kindness followed. Civilians began to mark their presence not with fear, but with memory. For every shell that fell, there was a story of a soldier who helped rebuild a wall, fed a child, or simply smiled in reassurance. The contrast between cruelty and compassion did not erase the horror of war, but it proved something vital. Even in humanity's darkest chapter, there were those who refused to surrender their light. Before the war, most of the American soldiers who landed in Europe and the Pacific were not professional warriors. They were farmhands, factory workers, students, and mechanics. Many came from small towns where everyone knew one another, where kindness was not a virtue but a way of life. They had grown up helping neighbors through long winters, sharing meals during the Great Depression, and learning that a man's worth was measured not by his wealth, but by his decency. When these men were drafted or volunteered for the war, they carried that sense of community deep within them, even as they were trained to fight. The uniforms they wore might have changed their appearance, but not the values instilled by home. Training camps were built to transform civilians into soldiers. They learned how to shoot, march, and follow orders. Yet, there was no lesson that could teach them how to face the suffering they would see abroad. In basic training, discipline replaced tenderness, and fear was shaped into obedience. But when the shooting stopped and the men walked through villages torn apart by war, the humanity they thought they had buried resurfaced. The discipline that had kept them alive was joined by something softer, the urge to comfort, to mend, to make sense of the destruction around them. It was not weakness, but a quiet rebellion against the inhumanity of war. Some soldiers carried reminders of home with them, letters from mothers, photographs of wives, postcards of towns that looked nothing like the battlefields they now crossed. These tokens became anchors in a world of chaos. When they met civilians, especially children, those memories stirred something familiar. A young girl in France might remind a soldier of his sister back in Kansas. An old man struggling to carry water could bring to mind his own father, bent with years of labor. These connections were unspoken, but they built a bridge stronger than language. Each act of kindness became a way to honor what they had left behind. The US Army did not instruct soldiers to play savior. Orders focused on logistics, security, and victory. Yet in many small moments, soldiers chose compassion over command. When a GI gave away his rations or helped repair a farmer's fence, he was not following orders. He was following conscience. These decisions often happened in silence, unnoticed by superiors. But within the ranks, they spread like whispers, shaping the culture of the units themselves. The men who helped others found their own morale lifted. Amid the endless march of war, kindness became a form of resistance to despair. There was also an awareness, however faint, of what the war was meant to protect. The soldiers had been told they were fighting for freedom, for the defense of human dignity against tyranny. When they encountered the ruins of bombed cities or the faces of starving civilians, those abstract ideals became painfully real. Freedom was no longer a word printed in speeches or slogans. It was the simple act of sharing a piece of bread with someone who had nothing. In those gestures, the GIs rediscovered the meaning of their mission. It was not only to destroy the enemy, but to rebuild what cruelty had taken away. For many, this awakening was deeply personal. Letters home began to change in tone. At first, they spoke of battles and exhaustion, of mud and rain and endless marching. But as time went on, they began to mention the people they met, the families who offered them a place by the fire, the children who smiled even after losing everything. One soldier wrote, "They remind me why I'm here. They make me remember what home feels like." Those words, simple yet profound, captured the quiet transformation taking place within thousands of young men who had come to fight and ended up finding their humanity instead. When these acts of kindness multiplied, they began to define the American presence in unexpected ways. In liberated towns, the US flag was often greeted not only as a symbol of victory, but as a sign of relief. Civilians learned that behind the helmets and weapons were men capable of empathy. The image of the American soldier was reshaped, not by propaganda, but by personal encounters that could never be scripted. In the long shadow of war, this became one of the most enduring legacies of the Allied advance. A reputation not only for strength, but for mercy. By the time the war neared its end, many soldiers had changed in ways they could not have imagined. They had seen destruction beyond comprehension, yet they had also witnessed resilience beyond belief. Their acts of kindness did not erase the pain of war, but they offered something equally powerful. Proof that the values they had brought from home could survive even here. The origins of their compassion were simple, almost ordinary, but in the face of extraordinary cruelty, that simplicity became heroic. And long after the fighting stopped, it was those moments of humanity that would be remembered most vividly, not as orders followed, but as hearts choosing to do what was right. War is often measured in numbers, territories gained, enemies captured, missions completed. Yet in the villages and fields where American GIs moved from one front to the next, the true measure of their presence was not only military, but human. Each small act of kindness altered the rhythm of life amid chaos. When soldiers shared rations, offered blankets, or repaired roofs, they created a fragile sense of stability that neither gunfire nor destruction could erase. The battlefield was still brutal, but through those gestures, civilians began to see the soldiers not as conquerors, but as protectors. Trust, once unthinkable, began to grow from the ruins. In towns that had endured occupation, this trust often came slowly. The first time a soldier knocked on a door without demanding entry, the silence that followed was heavy with fear. Then, when the door opened and nothing was taken, only words exchanged or help offered, a small seed of hope was planted. Children would begin to wander closer to the camps, drawn by curiosity and the smell of cooked food. A GI might crouch down, offering a piece of chocolate, and watch as suspicion turned into a cautious smile. These were simple acts, but in the context of war, they were revolutionary. They softened the edges of conflict, even if only for a moment. For the soldiers themselves, these interactions were more than charity. They became emotional lifelines in a world where death was a daily companion. A unit that had lost friends in battle could find solace in helping a family rebuild a broken wall or fixing a farmer's plow. It reminded them that not everything around them was destruction. One veteran later described it as a small piece of sanity in an insane world. These encounters reconnected the men to the idea of purpose, not just survival. They were fighting not merely to win, but to restore life to places that had forgotten what peace felt like. The effect of these gestures rippled through the battlefield in unexpected ways. In some regions, local civilians began guiding US troops through safe routes, warning them about mines or hidden enemy positions. Others shared food or offered shelter to injured men separated from their units. The compassion the soldiers had shown returned to them in kind, creating a cycle of mutual protection that could not have been planned. Commanders noted that cooperation with civilians often led to faster progress through hostile areas, reducing resistance and saving lives. What began as spontaneous kindness became an unspoken form of strategy, built on trust instead of force. Amid the bombed-out ruins of Normandy, one GI recalled helping a woman gather the remains of her home after a shelling. She could not speak English, and he could not understand French, but together they worked in silence, moving bricks, clearing debris. At the end, she pressed a flower into his hand, a single sign of gratitude from a world turned upside down. He later wrote that moment down in his journal, saying it felt like a truce between two kinds of suffering. Such moments did not change the course of the war, but they changed the people fighting it. They gave the soldiers something to hold on to that was not a weapon. Even in the thick of combat, the awareness of the civilians nearby altered how some soldiers fought. Many became more cautious with their fire, mindful of homes still occupied by families hiding in basements. Medics, already overwhelmed, often treated wounded civilians alongside the injured soldiers, refusing to see a difference between them. These choices required both courage and compassion, for every act of mercy risked slowing the advance or exposing them to danger. Yet they did it anyway, because they understood that victory without humanity was hollow. On those frozen nights when shells lit the sky, mercy became their quiet rebellion against despair. For the civilians, these moments were lifelines in their own right. Each small kindness, a shared blanket, a repaired door, a kind word, helped them reclaim fragments of normal life. They began to clean streets, reopen bakeries, and rebuild schools, often with the soldiers' help. In some places, laughter returned, fragile but real. A few soldiers joined in local prayers or meals, sitting beside people whose language they could not speak, yet whose gratitude they could feel. War had taken everything from these communities, but the presence of men who cared enough to help gave them reason to believe that life might continue after all. In the grand machinery of war, such moments often went unnoticed by history books or official records, yet they shaped morale and gave the conflict a human dimension that numbers could never capture. Every soldier who offered kindness carried a spark of home into enemy territory, and every civilian who received it carried that spark forward into recovery. The battlefield, in those brief exchanges, became more than a place of death. It became a space where compassion refused to die, and in that defiance, both soldier and civilian found the strength to endure what came next. As the Allied forces advanced deeper into occupied territories, word of the Americans' unexpected compassion began to spread far beyond the immediate battle zones. In towns recently liberated from years of occupation, whispers traveled quickly from one village to the next. The Americans feed the children, people said. They do not steal, they help. For communities that had lived through endless fear, these stories were almost unbelievable. Yet they grew, passed along by survivors who had seen the GIs not just as soldiers, but as human beings willing to share what little they had. This quiet reputation began to reshape how civilians viewed the war and their liberators. Hope, which had been buried beneath years of violence, began to rise again. In many regions, the shift was palpable. Villagers who once fled at the sound of approaching engines now stepped out to wave, offering bread or small tokens of gratitude. Markets reopened in places where trade had long been silent. When soldiers returned to towns they had passed before, they found that people remembered them, by name, by face, by the kindness they had shown. For many, those gestures restored a sense of dignity that war had stripped away. In the ruins of what had been their homes, civilians began to see themselves not as victims, but as participants in rebuilding their world. The soldiers, without realizing it, had become symbols of renewal. The wider impact of these moments reached beyond simple morale. Allied command noticed that regions with stronger civilian cooperation often stabilized faster. Resistance networks began to work more closely with advancing troops, using trust as a bridge between military necessity and humanitarian need. Some officers quietly encouraged their men to continue showing compassion, seeing the tactical value in winning hearts as well as battles. Yet for the soldiers, this was never about orders, it was about connection. Their humanity, once tested by war, became their greatest tool in bringing peace to shattered lands. Even in the Pacific, where the fighting was fiercer and the fear between cultures ran deeper, there were moments that mirrored those in Europe. Civilians hiding in destroyed villages learned that some American troops offered medical care, shared food, or protected them from harm. The war remained brutal, but those acts proved that empathy could cross even the widest divides. When news of such stories reached home through letters and reports, they painted a more complex picture of the war, one where courage was measured not only by how well a man fought, but by how deeply he cared. For the GIs, the experience left an emotional imprint that lasted long after the fighting moved on. Many wrote to their families about the people they had met, the little girl who clung to her doll despite losing her home, the old man who gave them a prayer in a language they did not understand. These stories filled the spaces between battle reports and censored letters, offering families back home a glimpse of something worth believing in. The war had shown the worst of humanity, but these stories showed the best. Parents reading those letters could feel pride not only in their sons' bravery, but in their compassion. Among the Allies, the Americans' reputation began to change. Their ability to combine strength with generosity made them stand out, not just as conquerors of territory, but as builders of trust. British and French civilians often compared them to earlier occupiers and found something refreshing in their spirit. They laughed more easily, shared more freely, and seemed to carry a sense of optimism, even in the midst of ruin. It was a kind of moral power that no weapon could replicate. In time, that image would shape how the post-war world saw America itself, a nation that had not only fought tyranny, but had offered kindness in its wake. For civilians, the consequences were deeply personal. Many survivors carried the memory of a single moment, a soldier's helping hand, a smile, a shared meal, as a symbol of survival. Decades later, those memories would resurface in memoirs and interviews, told by old men and women who had once been children during the war. They spoke not of grand victories or famous generals, but of a young GI who helped them believe that goodness still existed. In their recollections, kindness became as powerful as liberation itself. It was proof that the human spirit could endure even after nations had burned. In the larger arc of history, these quiet encounters became the foundation for something greater. They influenced how post-war aid was delivered, how reconstruction was imagined, and how nations began to see compassion as part of victory. The soldiers who acted out of instinct, generosity, and simple decency could not have known that their choices would ripple so far. Yet their behavior laid the groundwork for trust between peoples that had once been enemies. In the ashes of war, it was not only cities that needed rebuilding, but faith in humanity. Through their kindness, American GIs helped lay the first bricks of that foundation. As the war reached its final and most desperate months, the lines between chaos and compassion grew sharper. Cities across Europe and the Pacific lay in ruins. Entire regions turned to wasteland by retreating armies. Civilians wandered through, the wreckage of their homes, searching for lost family members, food, or even a reason to go on. Amid this devastation, the GIs pressed forward, exhausted and hardened, yet still carrying the faint spark of humanity that had guided them through so much suffering. The closer they came to victory, the clearer it became that their struggle was not only against the enemy in front of them, but against the temptation to lose their own humanity in the process. It was here, at the height of destruction, that the true power of kindness revealed itself. In the spring of 1945, the Allied advance accelerated. Town after town fell, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The soldiers marched through streets littered with memories, photographs crushed under rubble, toys buried in dust, and doorways marked by the absence of those who once lived there. Yet even as the war drew to its bloody close, they continued to reach out to those left behind. A medic might pause after treating a wounded comrade to bandage a crying civilian. Another soldier might hand over his last can of soup to a mother with a starving infant. These acts no longer surprised anyone. They had become part of the rhythm of survival. In the heart of destruction, mercy had become the only thing that felt truly alive. There were moments that would stay etched in memory forever. In one village, near the Rhine, American troops discovered a group of children hiding in a cellar. Their parents were gone, their faces pale with hunger and fear. The soldiers, hardened by months of fighting, fell silent. Then one of them knelt, opened his pack, and handed out pieces of bread. The children ate in silence, their small hands trembling. Another soldier found a broken toy and fixed it with wire and tape, placing it gently into the hands of a boy who had not smiled in weeks. In that dim cellar, surrounded by the distant rumble of artillery, something remarkable happened. The laughter of a child returned. It was a sound more powerful than any victory song. In the Pacific, where the war's cruelty reached unimaginable depths, similar moments unfolded. Civilians emerging from caves and jungles found that not all soldiers came with anger. Some offered water, medicine, and safety. Despite language barriers, compassion needed no translation. A Marine once wrote in his diary, "We came to fight monsters, but I think we became less monstrous because of them." That awareness, that kindness, could preserve the soul even amid brutality, was perhaps the most profound lesson the war ever offered. It was the human counterattack against the inhumanity that had defined those years. As victory neared, the weight of loss became impossible to ignore. Soldiers buried friends, comforted civilians, and faced the reality that peace would not erase the scars left behind. Many found themselves thinking of home, of families waiting across the ocean, unaware of what the war had done to their sons and brothers. In those final months, the line between soldier and civilian blurred completely. They were all survivors of the same catastrophe, clinging to fragments of compassion to remind themselves that life was still worth living. When a soldier shared a meal or carried a child to safety, he was not acting out of duty, but out of a desperate need to prove that goodness had not died with so many others. The climax of this silent struggle was not marked by a single battle or surrender. It came instead in countless small moments, scattered across ruined landscapes. A soldier refusing to fire on retreating enemies who had dropped their weapons. A GI sitting beside a grieving woman, saying nothing, simply staying. The war had taken nearly everything from them, yet somehow it could not take away their capacity for empathy. Those final acts of kindness, performed when there was almost nothing left to give, became the war's quiet redemption. They were proof that even after the world had burned, the human spirit could still choose light. When the ceasefires were declared and the soldiers began their long journey home, many carried the faces of those they had helped etched in their minds. Letters and photographs passed hands, promises were made to write, and sometimes, decades later, those promises were kept. Reunions between soldiers and civilians became symbols of what the war could not destroy. There are stories of veterans returning to Europe to meet the children they once fed, now grown and waiting with tears in their eyes. In those moments, it was clear that the kindness shown in the depths of war had not vanished with time. It had endured, passed from one generation to the next, as a reminder of what humanity can be, even in its darkest hour. The war ended with parades and speeches. But for those who had lived through it, the truest victories were found in the smallest of memories. A shared loaf of bread, a warm fire on a freezing night, a single smile that cut through years of suffering. These were the quiet climaxes of the human story within the larger war. History would remember the dates and the battles, but those who, there would remember something else entirely. The moments when mercy triumphed over hate and kindness, against all odds, refused to surrender. When the guns finally fell silent and the war's thunder faded into memory, the world awoke to a silence that felt almost unreal. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and soldiers returned home carrying the weight of everything they had seen. Yet, among the shattered buildings and broken lives, something invisible but enduring remained: the memory of kindness. For the civilians who had witnessed it, those moments were not small. They were beacons in the darkness, proof that even amid destruction, humanity had not been entirely lost. For the American soldiers who had offered those gestures, it was the same. Their acts had changed them as deeply as any battle could, shaping the way they remembered the war and themselves. In the years that followed, many veterans struggled to speak about what they had seen. Some never could, but when they did talk, their stories often returned not to the violence, but to the faces of civilians they had helped. A soldier might recall the smile of a child who had survived starvation, or the quiet gratitude of a mother who received food for her family. These were not tales of heroism in the traditional sense. They were confessions of survival through compassion. They revealed that, in a world obsessed with victory, the real triumph was in the refusal to become cruel. For these men, kindness was not weakness. It was resistance against the moral decay of war. Across Europe and the Pacific, the legacy of these moments took on a life of its own. Decades after the war, old photographs began to resurface. Images of American GIs surrounded by children, of smiling civilians holding the hands of men in uniform. Local newspapers in France, Italy, Japan, and the Philippines published stories of reunions between veterans and those they had once helped. In some towns, memorial plaques were dedicated not to generals or campaigns, but to the soldiers who had shown mercy. The people who had lived through the war carried those memories into their own families, teaching their children that compassion could be as powerful as courage. For the United States, these stories became part of a broader identity that stretched far beyond the battlefield. The image of the American GI as both warrior and humanitarian helped shape how the post-war world viewed the nation. It contributed to the trust that allowed the Marshall Plan and later alliances to succeed. The soldiers' actions had built a foundation of goodwill stronger than any treaty. Yet, it was not orchestrated or planned. It had come from instinct, from empathy, from the simple desire to help others in need. In this way, the kindness of ordinary men became one of America's most enduring victories. In classrooms and documentaries decades later, historians began to rediscover these untold stories. They noticed that for every grand operation recorded in history books, there were hundreds of quiet moments left unmentioned. A GI mending a child's shoe, another teaching an orphan to write their name. These small details did not change the outcome of the war, but they changed the moral texture of it. They reminded the world that even in the face of unprecedented cruelty, the capacity for good could survive. When audiences heard these stories, they did not only learn about war, they learned about what it means to be human in times when humanity seems impossible. For the veterans themselves, the acts of kindness they had offered often became their most treasured memories. In their old age, when the noise of war had long faded, they spoke of those moments with quiet pride. They remembered the children's laughter, the taste of shared meals, the fragile peace in a stranger's eyes. Some admitted that those encounters had saved them from despair, that helping others had kept them from losing their own souls. The war had taken many things from them: friends, innocence, and years of youth. But it had given them one lasting truth: that kindness, even in war, was worth fighting for. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the last living witnesses of that time grew fewer, but their stories endured. Museums displayed letters, photographs, and diaries where those acts of generosity were recorded. Teachers told their students not only about battles and treaties, but about compassion under fire. The soldiers who had once been young and frightened were remembered not only for their courage in combat, but for their courage to care. Through their example, Generations learned that victory is hollow without humanity, and that compassion can outlast even the greatest destruction. In the end, the legacy of those moments lives not in monuments or medals, but in memory. The American GIs who once crossed oceans to fight found something far greater than military triumph. They rediscovered the strength of empathy in the midst of ruin. Their story is not one of grand conquests or decisive battles, but of hearts refusing to harden in a world that demanded it. And as time continues to distance us from that war, the echoes of their kindness remain, reminding us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the smallest act of decency can light the path toward healing.